I'm a big believer that when you build and operate software hand in hand, you create better software. So I think, especially in the infrastructure space right now, we see most of the open source and most of the products, they come from the major cloud providers, they come from venture-backed startups. I think very few of the projects that have found wide success come from end users, meaning they haven't come from users that are building it incrementally to solve business problems that they're facing at that time. So I really strongly believe that when you have to operate your software and you have to, solve real business problems that you're facing, it just leads to better software. It leads to software that is easier to operate, that has the right features for operations, that actually solves real legitimate business problems. So I felt very strongly that developing this thing at Lyft, and in some sense, Envoy is a V2 to what I had worked on at Twitter. So, that's also part of this is I had some experience building a proprietary system at Twitter, learned a lot of things from that, made lots of mistakes like all people do when they go from a V1. So Envoy took a lot of learnings there, and I felt very strongly that we had developed something good. Now, we can talk about what happened after open sourcing later, right? It's like what has happened, I never would have imagined. But at the time, in early 2016, I think we were fairly confident that we had built something that was good, that was, relatively easy to operate, that solved a bunch of business problems. We were relatively confident that other companies like Lyft in Lyft's peer group would probably find value. And I think really what the decision process is twofold. One is that Envoy was not Lyft's primary business, right? Like Lyft is a ride-sharing company. So, at the time, there was no plan to get into the infrastructure software business. So I think in the spirit of open source and having built some of these systems in the past, and honestly just having a feeling of, well, if this is valuable to us, it must be valuable to others. This is not our core business. If we're successful here, maybe we can amplify our effort by putting it out there. I think that is what pushed us to initially have these conversations. But I think that, and I've said this before, I think a big part of it though, and again, we can talk about this more, is that I think a lot of us were fairly naive about what was really involved in doing open source. So the initial conversations in 2016 were honestly very, very simplistic. And they basically boiled down to, we've built this thing, we think it's valuable, we don't really know how to do open source really, but it's not our core business, so let's do some open source. And that's about the extent of it, to be honest.